Right, so the world of wrestling interviews and wrestling interviewing has definitely evolved over the last few decades. It used to be that wrestlers would just appear on TV to get interviewed. Before the era of shoot interviews and the internet shifted in, we then started getting those with your U-shoots and your RF videos, etc. And it brings us to where we are now, where a lot of wrestling interview content can be found right here on this platform, YouTube. And perhaps the most recognizable interviewer in the wrestling space today on the YouTube scene is none other than Chris Van Vliet. Chris Van Vliet has done hundreds of wrestler interviews over the years, and with that, like any other wrestling interviews, there obviously are a few that are a bit awkward, uncomfortable, and some even controversial and extremely heated at times. The wrestling industry is obviously full of egomaniacs and CTE galore, so when you've done hundreds of interviews, you're obviously going to run into a few of those wrestlers. We've done many videos talking about some of the most heated and controversial shoot interviews in wrestling in the world, so today we're doing it with Chris Van Vliet wrestling interviews as we look at some of the most heated, most awkward, and most controversial Chris Van Vliet interviews ever in the world of wrestling. So like the video, as the first question one may be asking is, what is the worst interview Chris Van Vliet has ever done, or who is the worst guest that Chris Van Vliet has ever had to be interviewed? And Chris Van Vliet would answer that question himself when he did a video with Maven Huffman a few months ago, and he had this to say.
I want to know, I don't have a fancy board, who was your most difficult interview ever?
I feel like most people come in and they're their best version. They know the cameras are on, they know they're mic'd up, right? But I had one guest who was just, from the start, just rude and just disrespectful when the cameras were off and when the cameras were on. And that person is MJF.
Now, it's actually not surprising to hear that Chris Van Vliet's worst interview experience would be with MJF. I mean, this was right before AEW had their first show, Double or Nothing, and MJF was really making himself known in the scene, and this interview was definitely something very different for the wrestling interview world. As Chris Van Vliet pretty much says, MJF was just being a douchebag the entire interview, even down to ordering room service during the course of the interview.
With the knife they brought.
No, I'm sorry. I'm really hungry. This is room service.
In the middle of the interview.
Chris, please don't talk. It's fairly rude.
Good evening.
Hi, how's it going? Oh, thank you very much. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Have a wonderful evening.
You have a good one. I'm going to have to go talk to this loser now. Ta-ta.
This has never happened before.
Chris, you hungry?
However, I think it goes without saying that MJF is obviously in character in this interview, and that's what obviously makes it so amazing. I'm sure it was definitely an interesting experience for Chris Van Vliet, but to be honest, I have my doubts that this was actually his worst interview. Another one of Chris Van Vliet's most interesting interviews is the time that he interviewed Dave Meltzer. Dave Meltzer, if you don't know, is a wrestling historian slash journalist who has ran the Wrestling Observer and Figure 4 Weekly for God knows how long. And if you're familiar with Dave Meltzer, you're familiar with him for one of two reasons, or both, and that's either his controversial reporting with many stories that may or may not have been correct, or from his controversial and divisive wrestling star rating system, wherein which Dave Meltzer for decades has rated wrestling matches on a 5-star scale, but sometimes also goes beyond 5 stars. It's a system that has caused debate amongst the wrestling community, with many people disagreeing with Dave Meltzer's rating and the scale at which he rates wrestling. And when he went on Chris Van Vliet's show, it was a pretty good casual interview at first, as they were just talking wrestling and talking wrestling history, but then the ratings came up and it turned more into a debate than it did an interview.
You know,
Was there a point in the 2000s when it was, you were tougher on ratings? Because I think in the 2000s, 2000 to 2010, you only had 7 5-star matches for that entire decade.
I didn't think there were as many great the matches.
Did you just not watch TNA? I'm just so curious.
Oh,
about
TNA!
That.
I watched TNA religiously.
Oh man,
I watched every TNA pay-per-view. I saw. Look, there were all kinds of 4-star matches back then, and I actually, if you look back on that, the different, you'll see it. 5-star match is like, to me, 5-star match even today should be like, okay, this is probably going to win match of the year. But even now, there's, I'm going to hear a lot more about, this match should be 5 stars. And it's like, to me, it's like, if I don't think that this is going to be somewhere pretty damn high in the ballot for match of the year.
Chris, in complete disbelief over the silliness of Meltzer's star ratings while still remaining incredibly polite and professional, is priceless. The discussion extends further as Dave is questioned on the people who haven't received 5-star ratings.
Because again,
But what about the list of people who never had 5-star matches?
I don't
I'm
even
sure,
worry
I'm sure
about
you're
it.
familiar with the people.
I don't even worry about it, because it's like,
But these are legends: Eddie Guerrero, Triple H, Randy Savage, Kurt Angle, and it's crazy. Rob Van Dam.
how many 4-star matches? It's 4 stars is what you should be looking at, not 5. 5 means like it's a completely different animal.
But then you got someone like Kenny Omega who has 10 5 or better matches.
Yeah. So,
but then if you're like, well, 4s are what matters, then
4s is what matters. I mean, like, hey, Kenny Omega and Will Ospreay and Misawa, those guys,
yeah,
they're freaking incredible. I mean,
Absolutely.
they're incredible. They're incredible, and they were put in positions to have those matches where most of these guys, Kurt, as an example, I mean, if Kurt was put in a position with a Misawa, if that's the guy, or maybe a Kobashi or whatever. I mean, he did with Chris. And like I said, I came close with but it's like, I've always thought Kurt Angle was great. He's got tons of 4-star matches, 4.5-star matches, whatever. 4-star match with Matt Morgan. But it's like, the reason he doesn't have a 5, it's what, am I biased against him? I probably voted for him in the Hall of Fame years early. It's just, it's a certain match. And maybe he never had the perfect opponent. Maybe, I don't know.
Though I will say Triple H is an interesting shout from Chris Van Vliet. It was a very refreshing interview to see here, and a really fun discussion and debate from these two here. It doesn't get too heated, however it is a little bit awkward at times, but speaking of absolutely awkward Chris Van Vliet interviews, look no further than the time he interviewed Austin Aries at the end of 2019. Austin Aries is a very controversial wrestler for many different reasons. You can watch one of my many different videos on Austin Aries to figure out why. But yeah, Austin Aries in short has always been known for his bad backstage attitude and running his mouth getting him into bad places. It's definitely held him back in his wrestling career, despite the fact that he's a very good and well accomplished worker. And in this interview with Chris Van Vliet, no topic is left uncovered as Austin Aries addresses many of his controversies at that time, including the Christy Hemme controversy from years prior in TNA.
Again, I think I have to do it again right. And she goes, and she says the name, and I stand on the second rope and I do my pose. And, I try to give her as much clearance as possible. I didn't think about heights or I didn't think all this thing through. But I wasn't acknowledging her. It was like she was now vanished. And I assumed she would just vanish if she didn't want to be there. That's not what happened. She kind of was obviously kind of like, what the fuck? And she kind of like tapped my leg and I hopped off and I just stayed in character and that was it. And
it was all very quick when you watch it back.
It's like 2 seconds, you know? And so I didn't think much of it. I just figured like, okay, cool. Like we got some heat. I was kind of a dick. Like I got to the back and no one said anything. Went through the rest of the taping. No one made any mention of it, that there was any issue. I got home, and then the next day I got a call from the office saying I was going to be fined $5,000 for the incident with Christy. And I was like, whoa, like what incident with Christy? And like, well, the thing was like, whoa, I didn't even know that was an issue. Like, why didn't anybody say anything to me? Like I was there the whole fucking day and no one came up and said what. I was like, yo, and it was Al Snow. And I just said, hey, Al, let me call Christy and like talk to her. I certainly wasn't trying to offend her or whatever. And so I called her. We talked for 20 minutes, and she, I explained kind of where I was at, and I apologized if, she fell or whatever, and I wish she would have came and said something to me. And she kind of told me where her mindset was. Initially, she wasn't, but as the day went on and people were kind of coming up to her, she started thinking more about it, and just, and I get, and I can understand too, like, being a woman in the business, like maybe some things can trigger you, and maybe it's not initially, or maybe when people start coming up and go, are you okay? Like, do you feel this way? And you start thinking about it, whatever. Like, I get it. She explained her part. I explained mine. I told her I didn't have issue with her professionally. Wasn't anything to do, and it was cool. And we ended the conversation in good terms, and all good.
And a very constant theme of this episode as well is Austin Aries' discussion about stigma around his height and him being short. It's something that comes up a couple of times in this interview. First is when Austin Aries says that he needs a big ego to make up for his small height.
I have to have a bigger ego than most because I need to compensate for my lack of height, because in this business, that shit really matters. So I got to have a big ego to stand on so I can see people and talk to them eye to eye. Except for Vince Russo. He's way too tall. I could never talk Vince Russo eye to eye. Always got to look down at me, Vince. Bro. Just trust me, bro. I've been doing this a long time. Really? Well, I mean, you're a former world champion and everything, so fuck.
But there's guys smaller than you that don't have big egos.
Who?
Daniel Bryan.
Okay. And?
Well, I mean,
I love Daniel Bryan. Daniel Bryan's a fucking anomaly.
Like Finn Balor doesn't have a giant ego. Like it is. What I'm saying is, it is possible. Just because you might not be as big as some of the former champions, you don't have to ride on your ego.
Not necessarily, but I ask, if we're talking like shoot, I'm a smidge under 5'8", barefoot. Right now, I'm really fucking lean. I'm probably about 160, 65 pounds. I don't think I ever topped 190. Yeah, I think my biggest ever was. I know 202 my whole career, never a day in my life. I was told my first match, every wrestler's 200 pounds. So my first match, it was my second match ever. Every wrestler's 200 pounds. And I'm like, I was probably like $155 at the time, right? And
Chris, there's plenty of other small wrestlers without egos. Austin, who? Chris, Daniel Bryan. Austin, okay, and Chris, Finn Balor. Austin, quick joke about wrestlers over 200 pounds to change subject. And the issue of height comes back up again when talking about the Bound for Glory no-sell incident from 2018, as they have discussions about the time that Johnny Impact made fun of Austin Aries' height on Twitter, with Austin Aries giving a rebuttal about Johnny TV's wife, Taya Valkyrie.
I'm not overly sensitive to it. I was trying to make a point to it. And so the tweet I crafted made the point, and I used the word husky about his wife, and I used it about his gay look, which I didn't know was homophobic. Like, I thought I was using it as a descriptive, kind of like Elton John. He's got a couple looks, like his normal look and his gay look. I wish I could pull off the gay look like Elton John.
Well, it's different because Elton John's gay, though.
And it's here and the Christy Hemme stuff where you really feel just how uncomfortable and awkward this entire interview is. Is it just me, or does Chris look really uncomfortable at times during the interview? But I am glad he pushed some of the issues everyone wanted to know about. Great job, Chris. Austin Aries is definitely one of the most controversial guests that has been on a Chris Van Vliet interview, but without a doubt the most controversial episode of Insight with Chris Van Vliet that has ever been posted was the episode with Velveteen Dream. Velveteen Dream, otherwise known as Patrick Clark, first burst onto the wrestling scene during Tough Enough in 2015, the WWE reality show. He was eliminated but would later get signed anyway, where he would go under the name of the Velveteen Dream, a flamboyant Prince-esque gimmick that went down really well in NXT. It was a good character, and he was a very good worker, and seemed like the future of the WWE at that time, but it all came crashing down from allegations of misconduct with minors. Can't really tell the full story in detail here. You can watch many videos about the Velveteen Dream controversy, but his career was never really the same following these allegations, and he opted to never respond to them until after he was fired from WWE due to wanting to stay in character, apparently. He would release his own response, but when he went on the Chris Van Vliet show, it was definitely the biggest platform he had to respond to everything that was said about him years prior.
That wasn't all I was called. I've been called a pedophile. I've been called pedo, nonce, very hurtful, and damaging titles to give a person. I didn't earn that. I don't have a history of malicious acts toward anyone. I never have. Everyone's got a past. Everyone's got lessons that they learn from and that they grow through. Everyone's got a past. Not everyone has a history, and a history is a repeated behavior, repeated offenses over and over and over again.
And he even shared an interesting story and claim about his arch nemesis EC3.
So EC3 invited myself, the two talents, and the female, who I don't recall who she was, invited us back to his apartment. EC3 brings out a framed black and white picture of Tom Selleck with a pile of cocaine on this picture of Tom Selleck. And he puts it down on his dining room table and he's like, let's party, boys.
Now, EC3 says he doesn't do drugs.
Okay.
This is without a doubt the most controversial interview that Chris Van Vliet has posted, as Velveteen Dream is obviously a very controversial figure, and Chris Van Vliet also got some backlash for platforming him. And what I found in researching this video is that the Velveteen Dream episode of Insight with Chris Van Vliet is no longer on YouTube on the Chris Van Vliet channel. It can still be found on audio, but it has been removed off of YouTube. So yeah, while Velveteen Dream and Austin Aries were definitely two of the most controversial guests, I think the most delusional guest definitely goes to Jake Hager, the former Jack Swagger from WWE, and of course former AEW and Lucha Underground wrestler. In this interview, Jake Hager talks many a time about how he's an undefeated MMA fighter. I mean, he mentions it about a dozen times. He talks about how much he likes his hat, and he has some very choice words for Tony Khan as he talks about an incident that took place at an alleged AEW talent meeting.
Well, anyways, I always find a way to say this every day, so I think everyone should too, say, fuck Tony Khan. I could tell that he didn't want me there. He offered me like a year and a half. I was like, bro, I just did Stadium Stampede twice. Like, don't act like Stadium Stampede didn't put AEW on the map. I was in the debut episode. I was the big spoiler, and you offered me 18 months after all that. So it was that and the way that he started running the business that it really, like, he wasn't a professional. Like, after all the Punk shit that went down, the boys got together and we had a meeting, and this was the boys only, no office. All right. And we're all like Sting's in there, Show, Jericho, Bryan, Mox, they're all standing at the front, kind of like talking us through this shit. And lo and behold, who comes into the room storming in? Daddy's little billionaire. And he's like yelling at us because I think it was Dax and Cash and Wheeler didn't want to come in. They didn't like the storyline, so they refused to come to TV that day. And he was like, listen, I'll put you in a 6-man 6 minutes before the show and you're going to do it. And we're all just like, all feeling disrespected. And I still to this day wish I would have stood up and said, you know, a lot of things. But like, you just told Sting that you're going to put him in a 6-man in 6 minutes, but then you're going to honor him for his retirement.
Now, these quotes from Jake Hager in this interview with Chris Van Vliet would get the attention of Dax Harwood and Cash Wheeler of FTR in AEW, as they were mentioned here, as Dax tweeted this saying, Cash and I were at the all-talent only meeting that was called by Bryan, Jericho and Mox. Tony never interrupted. Cash and I have never refused to show up to work, and I dare to say if you look at our schedule since Collision started, we're the most consistent talent that make both shows every week. I'm not really sure where all this is coming from, but it's mostly not true. Cash Wheeler will then follow up with a text conversation he had with Jake Hager, where Jake Hager apologizes, saying, I apologize if you're upset. I said I think it was you two, didn't say it definitely was, but that meeting happened. Cash Wheeler responded saying, I know, but to say I think and then actually say our names make us look like assholes, and it wasn't even us. We're assholes, but we show up for work. Jake responds, I apologize, I shouldn't have said your names, especially when I didn't know for sure. And then Jake Hager would quote this on Twitter saying, the meeting happened, FTR was not there, they can't deny the story no matter many text messages they post. Meanwhile, the story wasn't even about them, hashtag SMDFTB. I don't know what that means, but bro, you're literally apologizing to them in text, saying, oh, okay, actually, maybe you guys weren't there. I didn't say it was definitely you guys that weren't there. And now on Twitter, on public, you're trying to act all tough, but like, nah, you were there. You can show all the text you want. It's fine. But nah, bro, you're showing two different sides from your text to your tweets. Just keep it consistent. Personally, I wouldn't take anything Jake Hager says without a grain of salt, and I advise you to do the same as well. But yeah, despite all the drama that this interview caused, I think without a doubt, the real answer to the most dramatic and most heated Chris Van Vliet interview ever is of course the one with Anne Hathaway.
How much weight have you lost to get into this shape right now?
You did not just ask me that
No, I'm
question.
just saying, you're like,
what a forward
whoa.
young man you are. My goodness.
Wow, that sure was heated. It really looked like Selena Kyle was about to take out that quote, forward young man. But guys, that's all the time I have here for today to talk about some of the most heated and dramatic Chris Van Vliet interviews ever. If you can think of any Chris Van Vliet interviews in the comments that were just as heated and dramatic as these ones, then leave them down below. Credit and shout out to Chris Van Vliet, of course, for his great work with these interviews. I've listed all the full interviews links down below that I mentioned in this video. Like and subscribe with notifications on so you never miss a video on the channel if you did enjoy this one. For more wrestling interview content like this one and wrestling show reviews and general wrestling content, drama, history, you know it all. Subscribe. I'll see you all in the next one. Goodbye and keep on rolling.